Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to talk to you about something that weighs on the hearts of so many people, something that keeps us up at night, steals our joy and burdens our souls. It's unforgiveness. Some of you have been hurt deeply. Someone lied to you, betrayed you, abandoned you, broke your trust. Maybe it was a friend, a family member, a spouse, or even someone in the church. And if we're honest, some wounds go so deep that even though years have passed, the pain still lingers. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. Many believe that to truly forgive, one must forget the offense entirely, as if it never happened. But the truth is, some wounds run too deep to ever be erased from memory. Some betrayals, some words, some actions leave a mark that time alone cannot heal. The pain lingers, the reminders surface, and the echoes of hurt whisper in the quiet moments. Yet forgiveness is not about wiping the memory clean. It is about releasing the burden that memory carries. It is about finding freedom from the chains that bitterness and resentment create. When we hold on to unforgiveness, we believe we are protecting ourselves from being hurt again. We build walls around our hearts, thinking that if we stay guarded, we won't experience that pain again. But what we don't realize is that those very walls also keep us trapped. Instead of protecting us, unforgiveness binds us to the very thing we long to escape. The wound, rather than healing, festers. It consumes our thoughts, affects our relationships, and robs us of our joy. We become prisoners, shackled not by what was done to us, but by our refusal to let go. God calls us to forgive not because the other person deserves it, but because He desires our freedom. He sees the burden that unforgiveness places on our shoulders. He knows the damage it does to our hearts. He understands the way it slowly hardens us, turning us bitter, angry, and distant. And because He loves us, He commands us to forgive, not for the sake of the one who hurt us, but for our own sake. Forgiveness is an act of trust in God, a surrendering of our pain into His hands, believing that He will bring justice and healing in His time and His way. Jesus Himself is the greatest example of this. As He hung on the cross, suffering unjustly for the sins of the world, He did not hold on to anger. He did not curse those who mocked Him or seek revenge against those who had betrayed Him. Instead, He lifted His voice and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." In that moment, Jesus showed us that forgiveness is not about forgetting the pain, but about choosing to release it. He felt every lash of the whip, every piercing of the nails, every insult thrown His way, yet He chose to let go. He chose freedom over bitterness. He chose love over vengeance. We may not be able to forget what has been done to us, but we can choose to forgive in the same way. Forgiveness does not mean excusing the wrong or pretending it never happened. It does not mean allowing toxic people to continue hurting us. It does not mean that justice is ignored. What it means is that we refuse to let the pain define us. We refuse to let it control our lives. We refuse to let it steal the joy and peace that God has for us. When we forgive, we place our pain in God's hands. We trust Him to heal our hearts and to deal with the wrong in His way and in His timing. We release the need to seek revenge, to hold grudges, to dwell on what we cannot change. We open our hearts to healing. We make room for peace. Many struggle with forgiveness because they are waiting for their feelings to change first. They think that when they no longer feel hurt or angry, they will finally be able to forgive. But forgiveness is not a feeling, it is a choice. It is an act of obedience to God. It is deciding to release the offense even when the pain is still fresh, even when the emotions are still raw. Over time, as we walk in forgiveness, our hearts begin to heal. The weight begins to lift. The bitterness fades. The wounds, though not forgotten, lose their power over us. True freedom comes when we realize that our past does not have to dictate our future. What was done to us does not have to define who we are. We do not have to live as victims of our pain. Through Christ, we can rise above it. We can walk in victory. We can experience the abundant life that He has promised. But it begins with a choice to let go, to surrender, to forgive. Forgiveness is not about forgetting the past. It is about breaking free from its hold. Unforgiveness is a heavy burden to carry. Many people walk through life weighed down by the pain of the past, holding on to grudges, anger, and resentment, thinking that somehow their refusal to forgive will bring justice or protect them from further harm. But what they do not realize is that the one who refuses to forgive is the one who suffers the most. Unforgiveness is like a chain wrapped tightly around the soul, keeping a person bound to the very thing they long to be free from. The more they dwell on the hurt, the deeper the wound grows, making it impossible to move forward in peace. The truth is, refusing to forgive does not punish the offender. It only punishes the one who carries the bitterness. Many people resist forgiveness because they believe that letting go means excusing what was done to them. They fear that forgiving means allowing the other person to get away with their wrongdoing, as if forgiveness erases accountability. But this is a misunderstanding of what true forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not about pretending that the pain was insignificant or that the offense was acceptable. It is not about dismissing justice. Instead, forgiveness is about releasing the need to seek revenge or hold on to anger, choosing instead to trust God with the situation. It is about surrendering the weight of bitterness and allowing God to handle the outcome. Holding on to unforgiveness does not protect a person from further hurt. It only deepens the existing pain. When a person clings to resentment, they allow the past to control their present and dictate their future. Every time they recall the wrong that was done, they relive the emotions of that moment, keeping themselves trapped in a cycle of pain. The wound remains open, unable to heal, because they have not allowed the power of forgiveness to bring peace. Forgiveness does not mean the pain will immediately disappear, but it is the first step toward healing. It is a conscious decision to no longer be defined by what happened, but instead to walk in the freedom that God offers. Jesus understood the power of forgiveness more than anyone. As He hung on the cross, abandoned by His followers, mocked by the crowds, and suffering for sins He did not commit, He could have chosen to hold on to resentment. He could have called down judgment upon those who tortured Him. He could have allowed bitterness to take root in His heart, but instead He chose love. He lifted His eyes to heaven and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." In that moment, He demonstrated the depth of true forgiveness. He showed that forgiveness is not about whether someone deserves it. It is about walking in obedience to God and choosing peace over bitterness. Many people struggle with forgiveness because they are waiting for their emotions to change before they forgive. They think that when the anger subsides or when they stop feeling hurt, then they will be able to let go. But forgiveness is not based on emotions, it is based on a decision. If a person waits until they feel like forgiving, they may never do it. But when they choose to forgive in obedience to God, even when their emotions are still raw, He begins to work in their hearts. Over time, the anger begins to fade, the weight begins to lift, and peace takes its place. Forgiveness is not about the other person, it is about the one who is choosing to forgive. The person who caused the pain may never apologize. They may never acknowledge the hurt they inflicted. But holding on to resentment does nothing to change them. Instead, it poisons the heart of the one who refuses to let go. When a person forgives, they are not saying that what happened was acceptable. They are not saying that trust must be restored or that they must continue to allow a harmful relationship in their life. Forgiveness does not mean putting oneself in a position to be hurt again. It simply means releasing the offense into God's hands and choosing not to let it control their life any longer. Bitterness is a thief. It steals joy, peace, and love. It takes away the ability to truly enjoy life. replacing it with constant thoughts of resentment and anger. But forgiveness is a gift. It brings freedom. It allows a person to step out of the shadows of the past and into the light of God's grace. It opens the door for healing and restoration. It breaks the chains that have held them captive for too long. Forgiving does not mean forgetting. Some hurts will always be remembered, but those memories do not have to carry the same weight. They do not have to define a person's future. Through the power of Christ, they can move forward, not as a prisoner to their past, but as someone who has been set free. Forgiveness is one of the most difficult things a person can do, yet it is also one of the most powerful. Many struggle with the idea of forgiveness because they believe that in order to truly forgive, they must forget what happened. But the reality is that some wounds run too deep to ever be erased from memory. Some betrayals, some words spoken in anger, some acts of harm leave an imprint that time alone cannot remove. But forgiveness is not about pretending the past never happened. It is about releasing its hold over the heart and stepping into the freedom that only God can give. When someone holds on to unforgiveness, they often think they are protecting themselves. They believe that if they stay angry, if they refuse to let go, they will prevent themselves from being hurt again. But in truth, unforgiveness does not guard the heart. It hardens it. It turns pain into bitterness, bitterness into resentment, and resentment into a prison that keeps a person trapped in the past. The wound that could have healed remains open, constantly refreshed by the thoughts of what was done, and while the one who caused the pain may have moved on, the one who refuses to forgive remains bound to the moment of their hurt, unable to find peace. Many believe that forgiveness must be deserved, that the person who caused the pain must first apologize, repent, or make things right. But true forgiveness is not based on whether the other person acknowledges their wrongdoing. It is not based on whether they are sorry. It is not even based on whether they change. Forgiveness is a decision, not a negotiation. It is not something we do for others. It is something we do for ourselves in obedience to God. Holding on to unforgiveness does not punish the offender. It punishes the one who carries it. It keeps them chained to the pain, unable to move forward into the joy and peace that God intends for them. Jesus taught about forgiveness throughout his ministry, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. When Peter asked him how many times he should forgive someone, expecting the answer to be a reasonable number, Jesus responded with an overwhelming truth. Not 7 times, but 77 times. In other words, forgiveness is not a one-time act, but a continual choice. Every time the pain resurfaces, every time the memory comes back, a decision must be made to forgive again. It is not about forgetting what happened, but about refusing to let the past define the future. Jesus himself modeled this forgiveness in the most powerful way possible. As he hung on the cross, suffering the most brutal form of execution, he had every reason to withhold forgiveness. The very people he had come to save mocked him. His closest friends abandoned him. The religious leaders who should have recognized him as the Messiah rejected him. And yet, in his final moments, he did not curse them. He did not call down judgment upon them. Instead, he lifted his voice and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." That is the heart of true forgiveness. It is not about whether someone deserves it. It is about choosing to let go. Just as Christ let go of the offense against him, many struggle with forgiveness because they believe that if they let go, they are saying that what happened was okay. But forgiveness does not mean excusing the wrongdoing. It does not mean allowing someone to continue causing harm. It does not mean pretending that justice is unimportant. It means surrendering the right to seek revenge and trusting that God will bring justice in his perfect time and way. Forgiveness is not saying that what was done was acceptable. It is saying that it will no longer have power over your life. The enemy wants nothing more than to keep people trapped in unforgiveness because he knows that bitterness will destroy them. He knows that it will steal their joy, disrupt their relationships, and keep them from experiencing the fullness of God's love. But God calls his people to a different way. He calls them to release the burden, to let go of the pain, and to step into freedom. When a person chooses to forgive, they are no longer held captive by what happened to them. They are no longer defined by the hurt. They are no longer trapped in a cycle of anger and resentment. They are set free. Forgiving does not mean forgetting. Some wounds will always be remembered, but they do not have to hold power. They do not have to dictate the future. With God's strength, a person can forgive, not because the other person deserves it, but because they themselves deserve peace. When they choose to release the weight of unforgiveness, they step into the life that God has for them, a life of healing, of restoration, and of true freedom. Forgiveness is one of the greatest struggles of the human heart. It is easy to talk about, yet difficult to put into practice, especially when the wounds run deep. Many people carry pain from betrayals, broken relationships, harsh words, and injustices that have left scars on their souls. The idea of forgiveness can feel impossible because the hurt is too real, the memory too vivid, and the emotions too overwhelming. But forgiveness is not about erasing the past or pretending the pain never happened. It is about making a conscious choice to let go of the burden that bitterness places on the heart. It is about finding freedom from the weight of resentment and allowing God to heal what human strength cannot. Many people believe that if they forgive, they are letting the other person off the hook. They feel as though forgiving means that the person who hurt them is no longer responsible for their actions. But forgiveness does not erase accountability. It does not excuse wrongdoing or remove the consequences of someone's actions. What it does is release the person who was hurt from the prison of bitterness. When someone chooses to forgive, they're not saying that what happened was okay. They are saying that they will no longer allow it to control their life. One of the greatest dangers of unforgiveness is that it changes a person from the inside out. It begins as a small seed of resentment, but over time, it grows into bitterness, anger, and even hatred. It begins to poison relationships, causing a person to build walls around their heart, unwilling to trust or love freely. Unforgiveness creates a cycle of pain, where the one who refuses to forgive ends up suffering just as much, if not more, than the one who committed the offense. Instead of finding justice, the person holding on to the grudge becomes consumed by their own bitterness. Jesus understood the power of forgiveness, and he taught about it often. He knew that the human heart was prone to holding on to pain, but he also knew that true healing could only come through letting go. In one of his most powerful parables, he told the story of a servant who owed a great debt to his master. The master, in an act of great mercy, forgave the debt completely, setting the servant free. But that same servant went out and refused to forgive someone who owed him a much smaller amount. When the master heard about this, he was furious and sent the servant to be punished. The message was clear. Those who have received mercy must also show mercy. Every person who follows Christ has received the greatest act of forgiveness. No one is perfect. Everyone has sinned. Everyone has fallen short of God's standard. And yet God, in his infinite love, chose to forgive. He did not wait for people to deserve it. He did not hold their sins against them. Instead, through Jesus Christ, he offered complete and total forgiveness to all who would accept it. If God, who is perfect and holy, can forgive, then how much more should his people be willing to forgive others? Many people struggle with forgiveness because they think it must come from their own strength. They try to force themselves to feel forgiving, only to find that the emotions of anger and pain still linger. But forgiveness is not based on feelings. It is a decision. It is an act of faith and obedience to God, trusting that He will handle justice and that He will heal the wounds left behind. When a person chooses to forgive, even when they do not feel like it, they open the door for God to work in their heart. Over time, as they continue to walk in that choice, the emotions begin to change, the pain begins to lessen, the burden begins to lift. Forgiveness is not always immediate. Sometimes it is a process. A person may have to choose to forgive again and again, each time the memory of the hurt resurfaces. But with each step of obedience, they move closer to freedom. The enemy wants to keep people trapped in unforgiveness because he knows that it will steal their joy and keep them from living in the fullness of God's love. But God calls His people to a higher way, a way of grace, mercy, and release. Letting go does not mean forgetting. Some wounds will always be remembered, but through Christ they no longer have to define a person's life. Forgiveness breaks the chains of the past and allows a person to walk forward in peace, trusting that God is in control. It is not about what the other person deserves. It is about the freedom that the forgiver deserves. When someone chooses to forgive, they step into the healing and restoration that only God can provide. Forgiveness is one of the most challenging yet liberating choices a person can make. It is difficult because it often feels unfair, as if forgiving means that the pain someone caused no longer matters. It is hard to let go when the wounds are deep, the betrayal is real, and the memory lingers. Many believe that forgiving requires forgetting, that true forgiveness means erasing the past as if it never happened. But forgiveness is not about losing memory, it is about breaking free from its hold. It is about choosing peace over pain, healing over resentment, and freedom over bondage. When someone refuses to forgive, they believe they are holding on to control. They think that by staying angry, they are protecting themselves from further harm or ensuring that justice is served. But in reality, unforgiveness does not give power, it takes it away. It keeps a person tied to the past, replaying the hurt over and over again, allowing the offense to shape their emotions, thoughts, and actions. Instead of punishing the offender, it punishes the one who refuses to let go. The weight of bitterness does not fall on the one who caused the pain, but on the one carrying it. Many believe that forgiveness is only possible when the other person apologizes, when they acknowledge their wrongdoing, or when they change. But true forgiveness is not dependent on the other person's response. It is a decision made by the one who was hurt. If forgiveness required an apology, then it would mean that a person's ability to move forward is placed in the hands of someone else. But forgiveness is a personal choice, an act of releasing the offense. Even when there is no apology, no remorse, and no reconciliation, it is not about the other person. It is about the one who forgives, finding freedom in their own heart. Jesus taught the importance of forgiveness time and time again. When Peter asked him how many times he should forgive, thinking that 7 times was generous, Jesus responded, not 7 times, but 77 times. He was not giving an exact number. He was teaching that forgiveness should not have a limit. He knew that people would face repeated offenses, that memories of past pain would resurface, and that the choice to forgive would have to be made again and again. Each time resentment tries to take root, forgiveness is the answer. Jesus did not only teach forgiveness, He demonstrated it in the most powerful way as He hung on the cross, experiencing betrayal, humiliation, and excruciating pain. He had every right to condemn those who put Him there. He could have called down judgment. He could have spoken words of anger. But instead He said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. This was not just a statement, it was an act of love. It was proof that forgiveness is not about the worthiness of the offender, but about the grace of the one who chooses to forgive. Many people hesitate to forgive because they fear it means that what happened was acceptable or that justice will not be served. But forgiveness does not mean excusing sin. It does not mean allowing someone to continue hurting you. It does not mean pretending that what happened was insignificant. Instead, it is placing justice in the hands of God. It is trusting that He sees all things, knows all things, and will handle all things in His perfect way. When someone chooses to forgive, they are not saying, "It didn't matter." They are saying, "I will not let this define me anymore." The enemy wants nothing more than to keep people trapped in bitterness, because he knows it steals their peace, their joy, and their ability to love freely. Bitterness poisons relationships. It blinds people to the blessings around them. It makes them dwell in past pain instead of embracing the future God has planned. But when someone chooses to forgive, they break free. They refuse to let the past dictate their life. They step into healing and allow God to fill their heart with peace instead of anger. Forgiveness is not easy. It is a process, a decision that must be made daily, sometimes moment by moment. The pain may not disappear immediately, and the emotions may take time to heal. But each step toward forgiveness is a step toward freedom. It lifts the burden that has been carried for too long. It allows God's love to restore what has been broken. It turns the pain of the past into a testimony of His grace. Letting go does not mean forgetting, but it does mean moving forward. The past may always be remembered, but it does not have to define the future. When someone chooses to forgive, they are not only freeing the one who hurt them, they are freeing themselves. They are stepping into the abundant life God has promised. A life of peace, healing, and unshakable joy. Forgiveness is not an easy thing to embrace, especially when the pain is deep and the scars are real. Many people struggle with the idea of forgiving because they believe that in order to truly forgive, they must forget what happened. They fear that if they let go, they are somehow saying that the pain did not matter or that the offense was insignificant. But forgiveness is not about erasing the past. It is about being freed from its grip. It is about choosing not to let bitterness and resentment define the future. The truth is, some wounds will always be remembered, but they do not have to hold power over a person's life. Unforgiveness is a heavy burden. It is like carrying a chain that grows heavier with time, weighing down the heart, clouding the mind, and stealing joy. It creates a prison, trapping the person in the pain of the past. And yet, many hold on to it, thinking that by refusing to forgive, they are protecting themselves. They believe that keeping the hurt close will ensure they are never hurt again. But the reality is that unforgiveness does not protect, it destroys. It does not bring justice, it deepens suffering. It does not offer strength, it drains the soul. Forgiveness is not about whether the other person deserves it. It is not about whether they apologize, whether they feel remorse, or whether they have changed. Forgiveness is a choice that the one who was hurt must make, not for the sake of the offender, but for their own peace. If forgiveness depended on the actions of others, then healing would always be beyond reach, waiting for something that may never come. But God calls His people to forgive regardless of whether the other person ever acknowledges the pain they caused. Jesus understood this when He taught about forgiveness. He told His followers that if they did not forgive others, their Father in heaven would not forgive them. This was not a suggestion, it was a command. And it was not because God takes pleasure in asking hard things of His people, but because He knows that without forgiveness they cannot experience true freedom. When Jesus hung on the cross, He demonstrated this in the most powerful way. He had been betrayed, beaten, and mocked. The very people He came to save had turned against Him. And yet, instead of responding with anger or calling down judgment, He looked upon them with love and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." In that moment, He showed that forgiveness is not about the worthiness of the offender, but about the grace of the one who forgives. Many hesitate to forgive because they confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. They fear that forgiving means they must allow the person back into their life, restore trust, or continue a relationship that is harmful. But forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same. Forgiveness is given freely, but trust must be rebuilt. A person can forgive someone and still set healthy boundaries. They can release the offense and still choose to walk away from a toxic situation. Forgiveness does not mean subjecting oneself to further harm. It simply means refusing to be held hostage by anger and resentment. The enemy loves to keep people trapped in unforgiveness because he knows it robs them of their joy, peace, and ability to love fully. When bitterness takes root, it does not stay contained, it spreads. It affects relationships, poisons the heart, and blinds people to the goodness of God. It turns pain into a permanent state rather than a wound that can heal. But when a person chooses to forgive, they break free from that cycle. They refuse to let the past control them. They step into healing, allowing God to restore what was broken. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It is about surrendering the pain to God. It is trusting Him to bring justice in His perfect way and in His perfect time. It is believing that He can bring good out of even the deepest hurts. It is a process, sometimes a daily decision, but with each step, the burden grows lighter, the heart becomes freer, the soul experiences peace that cannot be found in holding on to anger. Letting go does not mean the past disappears, but it does mean that it no longer defines the future. The memory of the hurt may remain, but its power is broken. Through forgiveness, God offers a new way forward, one of healing, redemption, and true freedom.